The Los Angeles airport buzzed with its usual energy, voices mixed with the rumble of suitcase wheels, flight announcements echoed overhead, and travelers rushed from one terminal to the next. Among the crowd, standing calmly in the first-class line, was Keanu Reeves. He was dressed simply, wearing a plaid shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. A well-worn backpack slung over his shoulder completed his understated look. Unlike the luxury radiated by most of the passengers around him, Keanu stood out by blending in. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the hurried and anxious expressions surrounding him, exuding a quiet confidence that only a few noticed. Further down the line stood Matthew Cole, a sharply dressed businessman in a tailored suit and polished leather shoes that gleamed under the airport's fluorescent lights. Matthew's every move exuded precision. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, and scanned the line with an air of superiority. When his gaze landed on Keanu, he couldn't help but smirk, unable to reconcile the man's casual attire with the luxury of first-class travel. As the line inched forward, Matthew took his chance to speak. "First class, huh?" he said with a smile that was more sneer than anything else. "Never know who you'll find here these days." Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression calm and neutral. "Yeah, the world's full of surprises," he replied. Matthew frowned, expecting a different reaction, perhaps embarrassment or defensiveness. But Keanu's composed response left him momentarily unsettled. He decided to push further. "Nothing personal," Matthew added, "but you don't seem like the type for first class. It's rare to see someone so casual here." Keanu met his gaze briefly and then turned back to the counter as the line moved forward. "I guess we all have different ways of fitting in," he said with a faint smile. Matthew let out a short laugh, shaking his head. To him, Keanu's presence felt out of place, almost like a disruption to the exclusivity of the first-class experience. The boarding call for first-class passengers finally came, and the line began moving. Keanu and Matthew, holding their tickets, stepped forward at the same time. While Matthew walked with confident strides, Keanu maintained his unhurried pace, as if entirely unaffected by the rush around him. When they boarded the plane, Matthew stopped in his tracks. Checking his ticket once more, he realized, to his surprise, that his seat was right next to Keanu's. "You've got to be kidding me," Matthew muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he sank into his seat. Keanu glanced at him, his calm demeanor unbroken. "Looks like we're flying together," he said, settling in with an air of tranquility. Matthew crossed his arms, trying to mask his discomfort. He couldn't explain why Keanu's presence unsettled him so much, but he knew he didn't like it. As the flight attendants began preparing for takeoff, Matthew found himself unable to resist engaging Keanu further. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with condescension. Keanu, who was tucking his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up. "I work in film," he replied simply. "Oh," Matthew said, feigning interest. "Commercials? Indie stuff?" Keanu gave a small smile. "Something like that." Matthew chuckled. "Well, I suppose everyone has to start somewhere. But you know," he added, gesturing around the first-class cabin, "this isn't exactly a space for beginners. First class is earned, through hard work, success, and knowing how to enjoy the finer things in life." Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked out the window for a moment, as if contemplating the clouds outside. Then, turning back to Matthew, he said, "Maybe. But sometimes, it's less about where you are and more about how you got there." The answer caught Matthew off guard, though he quickly masked his reaction with a scoff. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "But let me tell you, in the real world, success speaks for itself." Keanu's calm expression didn't waver. "Maybe true success doesn't need to speak at all." Matthew laughed, louder than necessary, drawing a few glances from the other passengers. "Nice one. You should write fortune cookies or something. Keanu gave a polite nod and turned his attention back to his backpack, pulling out a book. Matthew watched him with growing irritation. He had expected Keanu to be rattled, to offer excuses or explanations, but instead, Keanu's quiet confidence left him feeling oddly powerless. The in-flight service began shortly after the plane reached cruising altitude. When the flight attendant arrived at their row, Matthew seized the opportunity to assert his status. "I'll have the Dom Perignon," he said, flashing a smile. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. When it was Keanu's turn, he simply said, "Water, please." Matthew couldn't help himself. "Water?" he asked, letting out a short laugh. "Don't tell me you're wasting a first-class ticket on water." Keanu accepted the bottle of water from the flight attendant and replied, "I'm fine with this. Sometimes, simplicity is enough." Matthew shook his head, leaning back in his seat with an exaggerated sigh. "Well, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone's cut out to enjoy the best life has to offer." Keanu took a sip of his water, then looked over at Matthew. "Maybe the best is different for everyone." The quiet conviction in Keanu's voice silenced Matthew for a moment. Around them, other passengers were beginning to take notice of their interaction. Some exchanged glances, while others subtly leaned in to listen. Matthew, unwilling to let the conversation end on Keanu's terms, decided to push further. "You know," he said, swirling his champagne glass, "life is like first class. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, some people just get lucky." Keanu turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Passengers nearby exchanged approving nods, and Matthew felt the weight of their judgment. For the first time, he was aware that his arrogance was becoming uncomfortable, not just for Keanu, but for everyone around them. As the flight continued, the tension between Keanu and Matthew became more palpable, drawing quiet attention from nearby passengers. Though Matthew tried to dominate the conversation, his jabs and remarks seemed to bounce off Keanu's unshakable calm. The flight attendant returned with another round of drinks. Matthew, feeling the eyes of the cabin on him, raised his glass dramatically. "Here's to success," he said loudly, flashing a confident smile. "Some of us work hard to earn it. Others," he glanced at Keanu, "just stumble into it." Keanu turned to face him, his calm eyes meeting Matthew's with a quiet intensity. "I think success is about what you give, not just what you get," he said. Matthew raised an eyebrow, smirking. "That's a nice thought, but let's be real. Success is about winning, about being the best. People respect you because of what you can show for yourself." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering Matthew's words. "Maybe," he replied, "but I think respect is more about how you treat others than how much you have." The quiet statement hung in the air, echoing louder than Matthew's toast. Several passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of admiration for Keanu and subtle disapproval for Matthew's arrogance. Matthew shifted in his seat, his confident facade beginning to crack. "Look, I'm just saying, you have to prove yourself in this world," he said, his tone a little sharper now. "People won't just hand you respect." Keanu gave a small smile. "True. But proving yourself doesn't mean tearing others down. It means lifting them up." The words landed harder than Matthew anticipated. For the first time, he found himself struggling to respond. He took a long sip of his champagne, trying to hide his discomfort. The flight attendant, clearly sensing the tension, approached Keanu with a polite smile. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to let you know that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed," she said. "He also sends his regards." The name Reeves seemed to ripple through the cabin. A murmur began to spread as passengers exchanged surprised glances. Slowly, recognition dawned on their faces. "Wait," someone whispered from a nearby seat. "Is that Keanu Reeves?" Matthew froze, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. His mind raced as he replayed their entire conversation. The realization hit him like a freight train: the man he had been belittling wasn't just anyone, he was Keanu Reeves, an internationally beloved actor known not just for his talent but for his humility and kindness. Keanu, seemingly unaffected by the growing murmurs, nodded politely to the flight attendant and turned back to his book. But Matthew couldn't let it go. You're Keanu Reeves?" he asked, his voice faltering for the first time. Keanu looked up, his calm expression unchanged. "Yes." Matthew blinked, struggling to process the information. "I didn't. I mean, you didn't say anything." Keanu shrugged slightly. "I didn't think it was necessary." The simplicity of the statement left Matthew speechless. Around them, passengers whispered and nodded in quiet awe, their gazes shifting between Keanu and the man who had been trying to provoke him. Matthew cleared his throat, his earlier bravado completely gone. I didn't know," he stammered. Keanu smiled faintly. "Does it change anything?" The question caught Matthew off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He suddenly felt exposed, as if the entire cabin could see through the facade he had carefully constructed. The murmurs in the cabin began to subside as passengers returned to their own conversations, though the occasional glance in Keanu's direction showed the lingering impact of the revelation. Matthew, however, couldn't shake the growing discomfort in his chest. He shifted awkwardly in his seat, avoiding eye contact with the man he had spent the better part of the flight belittling. His confidence, once so unshakable, now felt hollow. "I didn't mean," Matthew started, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I mean, I didn't realize who you were." Keanu turned to him, his expression as calm and unbothered as ever. "It's okay. You don't need to apologize for not recognizing me." "No, it's not just that," Matthew said quickly, feeling the weight of his own words. "I mean, the things I said. I didn't mean to be arrogant." Keanu offered, a hint of amusement in his tone. Matthew winced but nodded. "Yeah. That." Keanu leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You know, Matthew, the way we treat others often reflects more about ourselves than we realize. Sometimes, it's not about the person we're talking to, it's about what we're trying to prove to ourselves." Matthew frowned, his mind racing. "What are you saying? That I'm insecure or something?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He took a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. "I'm saying that the need to put others down often comes from a place of fear of not being enough." The words hit harder than Matthew expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but no argument came to mind. Instead, he felt a strange lump form in his throat, a rare feeling of vulnerability creeping in. "Look," Matthew said after a moment, his voice softer, "I guess I've just always believed you have to fight to be respected. Show people you're on top, or they'll walk all over you." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "The world can be competitive, sure. But respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn by the way you treat people." Matthew stared at him, feeling a strange mix of frustration and understanding. It was as if Keanu's words were peeling back layers of his own defenses, exposing truths he wasn't ready to confront. The flight attendant returned to their row, offering another round of drinks. Matthew waved her off, his champagne untouched on the tray table. Keanu thanked her politely as she handed him another bottle of water. As the plane began its descent, the weight of the conversation hung heavily between them. Matthew's usual air of superiority had all but disappeared, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of self-doubt. Finally, as the captain announced their approach to the destination, Matthew turned to Keanu one last time. "I don't get it," he admitted, his voice quiet. You. You could have put me in my place at any point, but you didn't. Why? Keanu smiled faintly. What would that have accomplished? Humiliating you wouldn't have made me feel better, and it wouldn't have taught you anything. Matthew blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the answer. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. As the plane touched down and passengers began to gather their belongings, Matthew found himself watching Keanu closely. The actor moved with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout the flight, helping an elderly woman retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment and offering a kind word to the flight attendants as he exited the plane. Matthew stood frozen, grappling with the realization that he had spent the entire flight judging someone who embodied the very qualities he claimed to value: kindness, respect, and humility. As Matthew walked off the plane, the weight of the flight lingered in his mind. The bustling terminal seemed distant, his thoughts consumed by the quiet lesson he hadn't expected to learn. He spotted Keanu ahead, moving through the crowd with the same unhurried pace, his backpack slung over one shoulder. A few fans approached him cautiously, and Matthew watched as Keanu greeted each of them with a warm smile and a few kind words, never rushing or dismissing their excitement. For a man who had every reason to act untouchable, Keanu Reeves seemed remarkably grounded. Matthew hesitated, unsure if he should approach him again. Part of him felt he'd already embarrassed himself enough, but another part, a smaller, humbler voice, urged him to say something. He quickened his pace, catching up to Keanu just as the actor reached the exit. "Keanu," Matthew called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. Keanu turned, his expression calm but curious. "Yes." Matthew took a deep breath, the words feeling heavy as he spoke. I want to apologize. Not because you're famous or anything, but because I realize now that I was wrong. About everything. The way I treated you, the way I think about people, it wasn't right." Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Matthew felt a rush of relief, but Keanu wasn't done. "What matters isn't what you've done," he continued, "but what you'll do moving forward. People can change, Matthew, if they're willing to learn." The word struck something deep within him. For years, Matthew had prided himself on being untouchable, always in control, but now he realized that his need for validation had blinded him to the simple truth: real success wasn't about power or wealth, it was about character. "Thank you," Matthew said sincerely. "I mean it." Keanu gave him a small smile, the kind that felt both genuine and encouraging. "Take care, Matthew," he said before disappearing into the crowd. Matthew stood there for a moment, watching as Keanu walked away. He felt lighter somehow, as if the conversation had lifted a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying. As he turned to leave the terminal, he noticed his reflection in the glass doors. For the first time in years, he didn't see the confident, untouchable man he had worked so hard to project. He saw someone real, flawed but capable of change. That flight with Keanu Reeves wasn't just a journey through the sky, it was a journey into himself, one that had shaken his perspective and left him with a newfound sense of humility. And as he stepped into the bright sunlight outside, Matthew knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't be the same man who had boarded that plane.